One ordinary teacher, one old phone, and a secret buried with 5 tons of stolen gold for over 70 years. When Mahama stepped forward in front of President Traore and hundreds of people no one knew, he was about to shake an entire nation. But here's the question: if the truth could rewrite history, who would be brave enough to speak it? The rain had passed. In the village of Kudugu, the earth still shimmered under a thin sheen of morning mist, and the muddy paths bore the quiet aftermath of a long tropical downpour. Water clung to the roofs of rusted tin shacks. Chickens stepped cautiously across puddles, their feathers still damp. The air smelled of wet soil, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of ripe papayas hanging from trees behind mud brick homes. And beneath it all was stillness. Not the kind born from peace, but the kind that exists in places too often forgotten. In the corner of the village where the gravel path narrowed and vanished into the tall grass stood a modest schoolhouse. Its walls were cracked. Its roof had a stubborn leak that no patch had ever truly fixed. The faded sign above the doorway read École Communautaire de Kudugu, the community school of Kudugu. Inside, Mahama moved like he did every morning, silently, carefully, deliberately. He was not the kind of man people notice first. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't walk with authority. He didn't command attention, and perhaps that was his greatest strength. A man in his early 40s, Mahama wore a frayed beige tunic and worn-out sandals that had outlived their purpose. His beard was speckled with gray, his back slightly bent from years of stooping over chalkboards, and his eyes, those quiet, observing eyes, carried both weariness and wonder. He filled a metal basin with clean water and placed it by the door. He did this every day. Some of his students walked over 6 kilometers barefoot just to be here. They deserved at least a drink before learning their first word of the day. Inside the classroom, he wiped yesterday's chalk from the board with a rag that had once been a shirt. He straightened a map of West Africa tacked to the wall, its edges curled from years of heat and handling. In the corner sat a wooden bookshelf, half empty, leaning slightly to one side. The few textbooks it held were patched with tape, their pages marked with scribbled notes and smudged fingerprints of children who had held on to them like treasure. And still Mahama smiled. This school, small and crumbling, was sacred ground to him, because here, despite everything, children still laughed, still questioned, still dreamed. Outside, he heard them now, footsteps in the mud, giggles, someone shouting, "He's coming! He's coming," as if he were a superhero in sandals. And in a way, maybe he was. They spilled into the courtyard like a flock of birds, barefoot, bright-eyed, carrying sacks made from old rice bags. They lined up without being told, already reciting yesterday's vocabulary out loud. Justice, courage, dignity. Words Mahama had chosen intentionally. He didn't just teach them nouns and verbs. He taught them how to see, how to question, how to remember. Because Mahama believed something most had long forgotten. That knowledge wasn't just survival, it was resistance. A small girl named Awa tugged on his sleeve. "Sir, if we had gold, could we build a new roof?" He looked at her and smiled gently. "We don't need gold," he said. "We have ideas. And one day, ideas build more than roofs." But even as he said it, his eyes drifted up toward that same hole in the ceiling that had leaked onto his desk the week before. He sighed softly. It was a normal day in Kudugu. At least it should have been. But if you look closely, if you really paid attention, you might have noticed something was off. The birds were quieter than usual. The old man who sold bananas by the tree hadn't opened his stall. The goats near the well were restless. And beyond the field, at the edge of the village, just past the school's boundary fence, the grass had been flattened like someone had fallen there. Recently. Mahama hadn't noticed it yet. He was too focused on preparing the lesson, too focused on which stories from the past to tell and which ones to leave out, too focused on whether to mention the mine near Kamasi Ridge, the one elders whispered about but no one ever taught in school. And yet in less than 1 hour, a knock at his soul would come, a choice would be placed in his hands, and nothing, no lesson, no roof, no history book would ever be the same again. Because sometimes the biggest stories start in the quietest classrooms. The lesson had barely begun when Mahama heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the giggle of children or the rustle of wind through the banana leaves. It was heavier, slower, the uneven crunch of footsteps over wet gravel, like someone dragging one leg. Then came the groan, low, hoarse, and full of pain. Mahama stepped away from the blackboard, chalk still in hand. The students looked up puzzled. He paused, listened. Another stumble, another gasp. He walked to the doorway of the classroom, narrowing his eyes toward the village road. The sun had begun its rise, casting long golden beams through the soaked fields. And then emerging from the morning haze, he saw a man. He didn't belong here. Tall, thin, pale as raw cassava. His shirt was torn at the side, soaked in red. Dust clung to his trousers. His lips moved as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. He was holding something in one hand, a small black object, but his fingers trembled so violently it almost slipped from his grasp. Mahama's instincts took over. He rushed toward the stranger just as the man collapsed face first into the dirt, barely 2 meters from the school gate. A few children screamed. Others peeked from the window, wide-eyed. Mahama dropped to his knees. "Sir, can you hear me?" he asked, checking the man's pulse. It was faint. His eyes fluttered, startled, lost, filled with something deeper than fear, urgency. The man tried to speak his accent, European, thick and strained. Blood ran from his lips. "Don't trust anyone," he whispered. "This phone, it's truth." Then with a last burst of strength, he shoved the phone into Mahama's hand, an old dusty smartphone scratched, dented, nearly dead. Mahama barely had time to process the weight of it before the man's body gave one final shudder. Stillness. Mahama froze, kneeling in the red soil, his breath short and shallow. His hands, one now gripping the phone, the other resting on the man's lifeless chest, trembled. The world around him went quiet. No birds, no chatter. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. What had just happened, he looked up, none of the villagers had seen. The school children were still inside their voices, muffled, unaware that just outside their window, a man had died holding a secret. Mahama glanced down at the phone. It wasn't locked. A smear of blood glistened on the screen. He turned back toward the classroom, then toward the overgrown path that led behind the compound toward the old well. No one used anymore. Swallowing his panic, he slid the phone into his pocket and gripped the man under the arms. He dragged the body carefully, trying not to leave a trail in the damp soil. His heart pounded, his thoughts spinning. Who was this man? What truth? What had Mahama just become part of? Behind the well, he laid the body beneath an old tarp used for storing rusted tools. He covered it with a few palm fronds, hands shaking as he worked. The man's lifeless face, turned toward the sky, seemed to ask him, "What will you do now?" Mahama backed away, wiped the sweat from his brow, and stared at his blood-stained sleeves. He should tell someone. The village chief. The police. But the man's words echoed louder than reason. "Don't trust anyone." He looked at the phone again. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried something far greater than plastic and metal. He didn't unlock it. Not yet. Instead, he returned to the school, washed the dirt and blood from his hands at the basin, and stood at the door for a moment, watching the children as they recited multiplication tables. They had no idea. And Mahama, he no longer knew if this was still just a normal day in Kudugu, or the beginning of something that could tear everything apart. That night, Kudugu slept beneath a curtain of stillness. The air was heavy after the rain, holding on to the scent of mud, charcoal, and damp leaves. Crickets chirped faintly outside, but inside Mahama's home, there was only silence and the low hum of something far heavier than sound dread. He sat alone at his wooden desk, the old phone resting in front of him like a ticking bomb. He hadn't told a soul. All day he'd taught with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his mind elsewhere, drifting between fear and disbelief. Each time his hand brushed against the weight of the phone in his pocket, it felt like the whole world leaned closer, listening. Now in the darkness of his single-room home, the moment had come. A candle flickered beside him, its flame casting long shadows across the peeling walls. He reached forward, hesitant, then picked up the device. His fingers hovered above the screen. The battery was nearly dead, only 8% remaining. He pressed the power button. The screen blinked once. A dim lock screen appeared, fractured, scratched. No password. Just a symbol. Fingerprint. He paused. His heart thudded louder. That didn't make sense. Why would a dead man's phone accept his print? Slowly, cautiously, he pressed his thumb to the scanner. A buzz. A click. And the phone unlocked. Mahama froze. Rows of folders blinked to life. Some were labeled in French, others just strings of letters and numbers. The internal storage was nearly full. Dozens of video thumbnails, satellite map captures, audio files. One folder stood out. It was simply titled Confidential 5MT. He opened it. Inside were 6 files. The first was an audio clip only 23 seconds long. Its file name, Kumasi Ridge Transfer Clear. He tapped play. The recording crackled at first, then a voice emerged. Male, European, calm, precise, without emotion. 5 metric tons, sealed at lower coordinates, local presence minimal, no confirmed witnesses. Extraction will proceed as scheduled. The transfer is complete. Repeat, the transfer is complete. This resource was never theirs. Then silence. No music, no commentary. Just a clinical confession stripped of all humanity. Mahama stared at the phone, his mouth dry. His hands trembled. 5 metric tons of what he played it again. Slower this time. Every word slicing deeper than the last. Coordinates. Extraction. The resource was never theirs. He leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the room as if expecting the walls to respond. His breath caught in his chest. The maps, the files, the voice. This wasn't a robbery. It was a system, a machine that had kept moving long after the world stopped watching. He set the phone down gently, like it might shatter if touched wrong. Then in a voice barely more than a whisper, he asked the only question that made sense. What have I just found? The candle flickered. Outside, a dog barked once, then went quiet. And somewhere deep beneath the soil of a forgotten land, the truth shifted in its grave, restless. Mahama no longer slept. By the second night, his eyes had grown hollow. By the third, his hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing too much too soon. The old phone rarely left his grip. Its battery died constantly, forcing him to charge it through an ancient adapter he'd borrowed from the village clinic. He rationed its power like food. At night, when the world lay still, Mahama worked. He sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by textbooks with torn covers and student notebooks repurposed for decoding. Pages once filled with multiplication tables were now scrawled with frantic handwriting coordinates, French transcripts, satellite metadata, short phrases written and rewritten as he tried to translate them into meaning. He had found more recordings, at least 6, some longer, some distorted. One video showed a cargo truck convoy moving under the cover of night. Another clip displayed digital readouts of weight pressure and sealed containment units stamped with codes he couldn't decipher. In one grainy photo, a French flag fluttered in the corner of a logistics tent. Men in uniforms were standing beside a large metallic crate half buried in soil, and always the same signature at the bottom of documents, SGG 5MMT, Operation Silencieuse, silent operation. Mahama repeated the phrase again and again, trying to convince himself it was all a mistake, but the facts refused to bend. He began mapping the coordinates by hand using an old-school atlas. Each point formed a crescent along the southern ridge, Kumasi Ridge, a place long rumored, often whispered among elders, but never truly questioned. He remembered how years ago a boy named Daniel had asked during a history lesson, "Why did the French leave without ever paying us for what they took?" At the time, Mahama hadn't known how to answer. The curriculum provided timelines, treaties, declarations, but not debts. It didn't explain why railroads led only outward or why rivers ran clear, but villages stayed thirsty. Now he wondered what else had been left behind, what had been hidden, but answers brought no peace. His health began to decline. He forgot meals, missed lessons. The children noticed. "Master Mahama looks like a ghost," one girl whispered when she thought he couldn't hear. By the 5th night, he had a headache so sharp it felt like something trying to break out from the inside. He found himself staring into his own reflection in the classroom window, whispering, "Who would believe a village teacher?" It wasn't just doubt, it was isolation. This was more than a secret, it was a wound carved into the earth and smeared over history like fresh paint. And now somehow it had opened in his hands. What was he supposed to do? Expose it to whom the local police were barely equipped to track livestock, let alone chase international theft? The regional administrator cared more about road construction than buried crimes. And the press? They hadn't set foot in Kudugu in years. He thought of going to the capital, But he had no money for travel, no allies in government, no protection. And what if someone was watching? Each time he left his house, he felt eyes. Each rustle in the bush sounded louder now. Each drone in the sky, real or imagined, made him flinch. He even stopped walking by the old well. Still, he couldn't stop. He wrote furiously, trying to create a record, as if should anything happen to him, someone might pick up the trail. He circled dates, highlighted sentences, scribbled names he found in hidden metadata: Mercier, Fontenay, G. Leclerc. Europeans. Contractors. Possibly government. He drew a box around one word, Traore. It appeared in one of the encrypted memos. A short message. If Traore finds out Operation Silencieux will collapse, initiate lockdown protocol immediately. The president, they feared him. Mahama leaned back stunned. What was his name doing among men who buried gold? And more importantly, if even they feared him, shouldn't he be the one to know? The posters had gone up 2 days before the ceremony. Faded, wind-wrinkled banners fluttered from electric poles and acacia trees. Loudspeakers on rusty vans blared the national anthem as they passed through Koudougou, announcing the impossible President Ibrahim Traore was coming. At first, no one believed it. The capital hadn't paid attention to Koudougou in years, its roads barely patched, its water supply unstable. But now the president himself would stand in the very village square, where goats usually wandered and school children played football barefoot. The occasion, a national initiative honoring unsung heroes of rural education. Mahama stared at the announcement nailed crookedly to the school gate. The president, here. It was a sign, or a trap, maybe both. For nights, Mahama had wrestled with the secret pressed into his hands, the voice messages, the maps, the whispers of theft buried beneath red soil. He had no platform, no allies, no power. But now suddenly, the man at the very top was coming to him, and Mahama knew this might be his only chance. On the morning of the event, the village transformed. Trucks arrived at dawn loaded with plastic chairs, metal barricades, and uniformed security. Soldiers paced along the main road, checking every face, every bag. A stage was assembled beside the old mango tree dressed in bright national colors. Children practiced a folk dance beneath the guidance of a sweaty local official who kept yelling about optics. The village chief wore a new robe. The regional governor arrived in a shiny white SUV flanked by aides with clipboards and sunglasses. Mahama stood apart. He watched from his classroom window, clutching a thin notebook with trembling fingers. Inside were 2 pages of handwritten notes, his attempt to summarize what he had learned from the phone. Behind those pages, the phone itself was hidden, wrapped in cloth tucked deep inside a satchel. Every few minutes, he looked toward the horizon where dust clouds hinted at an approaching motorcade. He hadn't told anyone, not even his closest friend in the village. He couldn't. The man's warning echoed endlessly, "Don't trust anyone." But silence had begun to eat at him. Each time he passed his students, their smiles reminded him why he'd ever become a teacher: to protect truth, to plant it even if it took years to bloom. And now the truth was in his hands, heavier than gold. At 10:42 a.m., the helicopters arrived. The sound was deafening. Children covered their ears. Dust swept across the square. Soldiers moved into tighter formation. Then emerging from the sleek black vehicle at the center of the convoy was a tall, imposing figure in a dark blue suit, President Traore. Applause burst from the crowd, though more out of awe than joy. He waved. His expression was calm, distant, as if he had already memorized what to feel. Behind him trailed officials, aides, and a small camera crew, broadcasting the visit live on national TV. Mahama's pulse quickened. He watched as the president climbed the steps to the stage, took his seat beside the Minister of Education, and scanned the crowd with unreadable eyes. Then came the speeches, long-rehearsed words about patriotism, sacrifice, and development. When the names of honored teachers were read aloud, Mahama's was fourth. He barely heard it. He was walking before his name was even fully pronounced, step by step through the crowd toward the stage, past the camera, past the soldiers. When he reached the base of the stairs, a guard stepped forward. "Identification," he said. Mahama nodded, reached into his satchel. But instead of papers, he pulled out the phone, still dusty. The screen dimmed. The guard froze. Mahama lifted the phone slightly and said loud enough for Traore to hear, This belonged to a man who died right outside this school. The president's eyes narrowed. Mahama continued, voice shaking. Inside it are files, maps, voices, and the truth about 5 metric tons of gold that never made it to the people. Gasps rippled through the square. A reporter's camera zoomed in. One soldier stepped forward, hand on weapon, but Traore raised his palm, stopping him. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Mahama stood under the rising sun, sweat soaking his shirt, the phone in his outstretched hand. And in that single instant, the whole country leaned in to listen. The applause had just begun when Mahama stepped out of line. It was a subtle movement, at first one foot sliding forward through the dust, then the other, until he was no longer standing with the other honored teachers, but walking slowly and deliberately toward the front of the stage. The soldiers noticed instantly. One shifted his stance, another lowered his hand toward his holster. The crowd's clapping faltered, confused. A voice from the stage called, "Sir, please return to your position." Mahama didn't stop. He raised both hands to show he was unarmed. His voice cracked with tension, but held steady. "Mr. President, please, this is important." President Traore, mid-handshake with the regional governor, turned to face him. Mahama reached into his satchel slowly, carefully, and pulled out the dusty smartphone. One of the guards flinched forward, but again Traore lifted his hand, commanding stillness. Mahama's thumb hovered over the screen for just a second, then pressed down. The device unlocked. The screen glowed faintly in the morning sun as he opened the recording. There was no ceremony in how he played it, no dramatics, just trembling fingers and silent resolve. Then came the voice. "The gold was always ours. Their ancestors took what wasn't offered. Let them teach their fairy tales, we have the facts. They'll never know what was moved nor where it went. And even if they do, who will listen to a village ghost?" The accent was clear, European, cold, detached. The square fell silent. A child's gasp broke through first, then murmurs spread like a wave. Gold fairy tales, who said that President Traore's face remained stone still, but something shifted behind his eyes, an old alertness, calculating. Mahama lowered the phone chest, rising and falling like waves in a storm. "This phone, it wasn't meant for me, but it found me, and I think you were meant to hear it." The president stood slowly. Without turning to his guards, he said one word: "Tent." 2 men stepped forward, approached Mahama, and with firm but restrained hands guided him away from the crowd. The phone remained in his hand, though he clutched it now like something sacred or explosive. As they passed through the line of soldiers, past the dance troupe, and the confused journalist, whispers followed him. People pointed. Some looked afraid. Others, intrigued. Inside the command tent, a shadow fell across the fabric as Traore entered last. And outside in the village of Kudugu, the air shifted. For the first time in years, the truth had a microphone. But whether it would be heard or buried deeper was yet to be seen. The interior of the green military tent was dim and cool, heavy, with the scent of canvas, sweat, and protocol. Thick flaps muffled the sounds outside. Applause. Drums, confused murmurs, sealing off the small circle of men now sitting in folding chairs around a plastic table. At the head sat President Ibrahim Traore, his face unreadable, hands folded tightly beneath his chin. To his right was his chief of intelligence, General Konate, a hawk-eyed man with silver at his temples. On his left, a presidential aide scribbled on a notepad, lips pursed. 2 guards stood inside the tent, rifles in hand, but eyes fixed only on Mahama. The teacher sat opposite the president. He had been given a bottle of water, but hadn't touched it. His hands remained locked together in his lap, fingers stained with chalk and nerves. The phone lay on the table before him, screen dark again. Its presence filled the room like a buried landmine. President Traore finally broke the silence. "Start from the beginning." Mahama nodded. His voice was steady, though each word felt like a rock lifted from his chest. 5 nights ago, a man came stumbling into Kudugu, white, bleeding, delirious. He collapsed outside the school. I tried to help him. He gave me this phone, told me not to trust anyone, said it held truth. He glanced at the phone. He died in my arms. No one spoke. Konate's jaw flexed. The aide stopped writing. Traore only watched. Mahama continued recounting the nights spent poring over files, the maps he traced, the voices he heard, the way each layer of information began to reveal something far greater than theft system. Something designed, hidden, repeated. When he mentioned Kumasi Ridge, the room shifted. Traore's eyes narrowed. Mahama pulled a folded paper from his satchel and placed it on the table. It was a hand-drawn sketch, rough but detailed. Arrows pointed to specific coordinates. A handwritten phrase below read extraction zones confirmed via satellite recon. Konate leaned forward, inspecting the drawing. The aide glanced nervously at Traore. "You're telling us," Traore said slowly, "that for years, we've had foreign actors smuggling gold out of our land under our feet, and no one knew." Mahama said nothing. The question didn't need an answer. General Konate exhaled sharply and muttered, "If this is true, we've been robbed blind." The president circled the table, once then stopped beside the phone. He stared down at it for a long time. "Opération silencieuse," he repeated the phrase. "I've heard rumors. Nothing official. Nothing traceable." He turned to his aide. "Shut down the ceremony. No media. No photos of this man leaving the tent. Then to Konate assemble a covert unit. I want boots on Kumasi Ridge within 24 hours. Full containment. No outside comms. If there's even a tenth of what this phone claims," his voice darkened, "then we're not just cleaning up a mess. We're confronting betrayal." Mahama looked up. "Why would your name be in one of the memos?" The room froze again. Traore looked at him directly. "That he said is what I intend to find out." Outside, the sun was beginning to shift, casting long shadows across the village square. But inside the tent, a storm had begun. For Mahama, it was no longer a question of if the truth mattered. It was a matter of who it might destroy first. Before the sun touched the edge of the savannah, the forest at Kumasi Ridge was already alive with motion. Dark green military trucks, muffled by tarps and dust nets, crawled silently down forgotten roads. Soldiers in matte black fatigues fanned out along the perimeter, scanning the underbrush with infrared scopes. A team of engineers followed behind them, hauling cases of specialized equipment, ground-penetrating radar satellite-linked survey tablets, thermal imagers and metal detectors calibrated for deep mineral detection. General Konate stood at the center of it all, his boots sunk slightly into the damp red earth, his jaw locked tight. He had deployed dozens of missions in his lifetime, but never one this quiet, this fast, this politically volatile, and this buried. By 4:17 a.m., the tech crews had begun triangulating coordinates based on Mahama's drawings and the data extracted from the phone. One signal spiked hard, metallic, dense, unmovable. They marked the ground with white stones. Another team moved in with shovels and electric diggers, cutting through soil and centuries of silence. It wasn't long before the first sound of truth was unearthed, a dull thud, metal against metal. The soldiers exchanged glances. They cleared the surrounding area with gloved hands. Roots had grown across the top of what appeared to be a large industrial crate. Its surface oxidized, its locks corroded shut. After half an hour of precise excavation, they revealed the lid. An engineer stepped forward, pried it open with a crowbar, and gasped. Inside, gold bars, dozens of them, each stamped with the same marking, a colonial insignia, a stylized RF engraved into a crowned crest, the ancient seal of the République Française. Stacked beside the bars were leather-bound folders, some cracked at the spine, others perfectly preserved. Documents, charts, financial ledgers sealed with ribbons and wax, names, transaction records, transport manifests. Some pages were still in French, others were coded. Konate picked up one document, stared at it under the beam of his flashlight. The paper bore a date, 1961. A handwritten signature followed G. Leclerc, the same name Mahama had mentioned. "My God," an officer murmured. "This isn't theft. This is an operation." Konate said nothing. He turned slowly as headlights swept the clearing. Another convoy had arrived. From the rear car, President Traore stepped out, dressed not in his ceremonial suit, but in a plain utility jacket. No media, no entourage. Only a tight cluster of security officers shadowed him as he walked toward the open crate. He stopped, stared. His face hardened, not in shock, but in cold realization. He picked up one of the gold bars, held it up to the morning light now spilling through the trees. Then he looked at Konate. "This was never lost," Traore said, his voice low even. "It was hidden." He didn't speak for a long while. The forest seemed to still around them. The weight of the gold was nothing compared to the weight of the silence. Traore walked slowly down the line of uncovered crates, 4 of them, now still more, being unearthed. One folder bore the title, Projet Ressources Souterraines, Confidentiel Militaire. The president turned to his intelligence chief. Secure everything. No leaks. Not a word until I've reviewed it all. Konate saluted, his voice grave. Yes, Mr. President. Traore stood still for a moment, holding one of the old ledgers in his hand. The leather binding creaked slightly as he opened it. Inside were columns of numbers and then names. Some were local, many were European. All of them complicit. He closed the book. They built empires with our silence, he said quietly. Then, with a breath that seemed to carry decades of ancestral weight, he added, not anymore. The first leak came quietly. An anonymous blog based in Brussels published a short article with a single image, a crate half buried in reddish soil gold bars glinting under flashlight. The caption read, Colonial Treasure Unearthed in West Africa. No names, no coordinates, no mention of Mahama. But by the next morning, the image had gone viral. French media dismissed the claim outright, calling it a fabrication, likely doctored. Belgian pundits called it revisionist fantasy. Several British newspapers framed it as a dangerous narrative born of conspiracy. And when a second blog, this time from Dakar, leaked an audio clip of the European voice declaring the gold was always ours, the fire only spread wider. International panels debated it. Governments issued denials. The French ambassador called the clip deeply misleading and malicious in origin. But closer to home, the reaction was harsher. In Koudougou, where Mahama had once been a beloved figure, whispers began to swirl. Traitor, liar, agent of chaos. Some villagers claimed he had sold the story for money. Others insisted he had invented everything to gain fame or government favor. Protesters gathered in front of the school shouting. Someone threw a rock through their classroom window. Mahama wasn't there. He was watching it all unfold from a one-room safe house on the outskirts of a nearby town, hidden under layers of secrecy arranged by President Traore's security team. He hadn't seen the sky in 3 days. He hadn't slept properly in 5. The small television in the corner was always on, flashing through news cycles in different languages. Each anchor had a new word for him: unverified whistleblower, controversial witness, delusional teacher. Even some local broadcasters questioned his story. One editorial called him a distraction from real development issues. He turned the volume down. The glow of the screen cast shadows across his face, tired, hollow drawn, tight from disbelief and exhaustion. His fingers curled around a cup of cold tea he hadn't touched. He wondered if he had made a mistake, if Traore's silence meant regret, if the truth really mattered when the world could simply choose not to believe it. A knock at the door jolted him upright. He held his breath. A voice whispered from outside, soft and familiar. It was one of the guards. "Letter for you, sir." Mahama opened the door just wide enough to take the envelope. There was no return address, just his name written in careful, almost childlike handwriting. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, lines slightly torn at the edge. At the top, written in blue ink, was a sentence that stopped his breath. "I still believe you, sir." Below it, a signature. Awa, one of his students. He read the line again, and then a third time. Something shifted in his chest, small, fragile, but real. Outside, the world argued. The media twisted. The people forgot. But somewhere in a dusty village classroom with a cracked chalkboard and broken windows, truth had planted a seed, and someone still believed. 3 days after the letter arrived, a knock came again, this time firmer, more official. Mahama opened the door to find a clean-cut officer in formal attire. No guns, no convoy, just a sealed letter bearing the golden crest of the presidency. Inside, only one line stood out. "The president invites you to speak. National radio. 1 hour. No censorship." Mahama stared at the words for a long time. His fingers tightened around the paper. He read it again, then set it down on the desk beside Awa's letter, now worn at the edges from how many times he'd unfolded it. He didn't answer right away. He walked in circles, paced, spoke aloud to no one, thought of what the world had called him: delusional, dangerous, naive, thought of what he had uncovered, thought of the man who had died in his arms, pressing the truth into his hand with his last breath. And when the sun dipped low behind the trees, painting the safe house in orange light, he finally whispered aloud, "If I stay silent, I'll become part of the lie." He said yes. The studio was smaller than he imagined, the kind of space used for early morning farming reports and folklore programs. Not grand, just walls lined with cheap foam and an old red "On AR" sign blinking in the corner. A producer nodded politely, guided him to the microphone, and clipped a mic to his collar. Traore didn't come. No advisors, no soldiers, just Mahama and the mic. At exactly 8:00 p.m., the signal went live. The host introduced him softly, almost apologetically, as Mr. Mahama of Kudugu, a teacher, a voice we've come to know controversially through recent reports. Mahama took a deep breath. Then he began. "I'm not a politician. I'm just a teacher who couldn't stay quiet." His voice, worn and low, echoed through radios, in taxis, kitchens, roadside bars, and quiet homes from the capital to the farthest villages. He didn't read from a script. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he told the story. The man in the red soil, the phone, the first time he opened the recording, the maps, the moment in the green tent staring across from the most powerful man in the nation. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't attack. He only described what he had seen, what he had heard, and what he believed every child in the country deserved to know. "History was never just what we're taught in school," he said, voice firming. "It's what we're never told. What was stolen? What was silenced?" He paused. "Let the words settle. Some will call me a liar. They already have. Some may say I've embarrassed this country, but I say truth is never shameful. Silence is." In the soundproof studio, the producer glanced toward the control panel. The call lines were lighting up one after another. In a bar in Bamako, two men turned the volume up and leaned in. In a school in the northern provinces, a teacher paused her evening lesson, telling the children to listen closely. In Kudugu, where it had all begun, a small group gathered around a dusty transistor radio in the village square, silent for once, eyes locked on the speaker's voice. Mahama's tone softened toward the end. "I didn't choose this, but when history knocks, sometimes it doesn't ask if you're ready, it just asks if you'll answer." He ended the broadcast with a quote written on the wall of his classroom one few had ever paid attention to. "The greatest thing a teacher can give is not answers, but questions no one else dares to ask." Then silence, no applause, no music. Just the crackle of the radio returning to the host's stunned voice. Somewhere a child whispered to her grandmother, "That sounded like the truth." And across the country, minds began to shift quietly but unmistakably. The next morning across Burkina Faso, the sound of Mahama's voice still echoed, not through speakers, but through memory. In villages and towns, from dusty cafes in Bobo Dioulasso to roadside tea stalls near Fadangurma, people spoke of nothing else. In taxis, the driver and passenger no longer argued about football scores, they debated Mahama's words. In market squares, women whispered his name between weighing millet and bartering over tomatoes. The radio station's call lines had remained open for 3 hours after the broadcast ended. The producers, overwhelmed, couldn't answer fast enough. Some callers wept. "I remember those trucks," one elderly man said from Gawa. "They came at night. No lights. Always guarded. We thought it was military drills. But they weren't training. They were taking." Another whispered voice, shaking. "My brother worked on that ridge. He said he saw crates. He disappeared a week later." A woman from Awahiguya spoke slowly. "My grandfather told me there was gold under our land. He said we'd never see it, but he never explained why." For the first time in generations, old memories long buried like the gold itself were resurfacing. And Mahama, quiet, tired Mahama, became something he had never wanted to be: a symbol. Not a politician, not a revolutionary, just the man who said what others were too afraid to say. And because of that, people began to draw strength from him. In Kudugu, the same square where protesters had once gathered now became a place of tribute. The broken classroom window was replaced, the chalkboard wiped clean. On the outer wall, a group of children led by Awa and her classmates painted a mural. It showed a tall, thin man standing under a massive baobab tree. His eyes were calm. In his hand, he held a glowing phone. Around him were children, book shovels, and beneath their feet, crates of gold hidden under red earth. At the top of the wall, they wrote in bold chalk, "Truth does not rot, it waits." Photos of the mural spread across social media. Hashtags in 3 languages began trending across West Africa. Mahama the witness. Truth from the soil, a teacher. Spoke meanwhile, Mahama stayed quiet. He remained in the safe house, watching the movement unfold, not with pride, but with disbelief. "They don't know me," he muttered once to the guard who brought him food. "I'm not brave. I was just tired of silence." But the guard simply replied, "That's why they believe you, because you didn't ask them to." Even international media began to shift. A prominent journalist from Al Jazeera requested an interview. A Ghanaian newspaper ran a front-page editorial titled, "The Teacher Who Shook a Nation." Suddenly, he was no longer the delusional villager. He was the witness. But Mahama wasn't sure if he felt victorious. He missed his students. He missed the sound of chalk tapping the board, the routine of sweeping the school floor before sunrise. He longed for the quiet, not the enforced kind, but the kind earned through peace of mind. And yet he knew there was no going back. He had seen too much, said too much, and now somehow his words belonged to the people more than they did to him. That evening, as he sat on the floor of the safe house, watching the sun stain the wall, gold Awa's mural came on the screen. A news anchor described it as a new icon of grassroots resistance. Mahama looked at it quietly. He smiled not out of pride, but because the children had drawn the tree exactly right. Even the little scar on its trunk where lightning had struck years ago. He reached for his notebook, opened to a blank page, and wrote, "The gold wasn't the story. The silence was." Then beneath it, "And now, we begin." The presidential convoy arrived without fanfare. No journalists, no marching bands. Just 3 black vehicles, a small security detail, and the weight of a nation's reckoning on their shoulders. President Ibrahim Traore stepped out into the sun-drenched village square of Kudugu, the very place where a teacher had once broken silence with a single phone. Now it was surrounded by faces aged with time, weather, and wisdom. The village elders waited for him beneath the wide branches of a centuries-old neem tree. Among them sat Mama Fumata, the oldest voice in Kudugu. Her back was curved like a bow, her skin folded like parchment, but her eyes sharp as broken glass. She had seen colonial flags rise and fall, soldiers come and go, but she had never seen a president sit down on the bare earth in front of her. Until now. Traore crossed his legs without ceremony. He listened as she spoke. "You came here because a teacher told the truth," Mama Fumata said, her voice soft but unshakable. But the truth didn't start with him. It started long before. In the stories our grandfathers stopped telling. In the songs we stopped singing. They didn't bury gold. They buried memory. The other elders nodded. An old man leaned forward. "When they came, those men with rifles and blue uniforms, they said it was for peace. But they took the land, and then the rocks, and then the silence." A third added, "Our children forgot. We let them forget. That was the real theft." Traore listened, eyes lowered. No aides interrupted, no officials corrected. He finally spoke. "The gold has been recovered. It's real. It's traceable. It belongs to this land." The elders said nothing for a long moment. Then Mama Fumata asked the question no economist or politician had dared to ask. "What will you do with it?" Traore looked around the circle. Then up at the mural the children had painted days earlier. Mahama under the baobab, the crates of truth beneath the soil, the light in his hand. "I won't decide alone," he said. "I came to ask you." A vote was held right there in the village, not with ballots, with hands and voices. The answer came not in unison, but in shared conviction. "Use it for our children," one elder said. "Not in silence," another added, "but in stone." "Let them see it, read it, remember it," Mama Fumata said. "Let the truth have walls." The decision was made. Within the hour, the president stood beside Mahama and announced a national referendum. "This gold will not disappear into bureaucracy," he said. "The people will choose its purpose. The people will right what was erased." That night, as drums played and fires crackled across Kudugu, a whisper spread through the air, not of revenge, but of restoration. And far above them in the starlit dark, it seemed even the land itself had begun to breathe again. The gold had not yet been moved, but it was already setting fires inside the palace. In the capital, behind thick glass and polished floors, The Council of Ministers convened in an emergency session. The long mahogany table was flanked by sharp suits and tired eyes. Folders thick with intelligence reports lay unopened. What mattered wasn't what they knew, it was what they would do about it. President Traore sat at the head of the table stone-faced. He let them speak first. The Minister of Foreign Affairs adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. With respect, Mr. President, this is not only about gold, it's about international alignment. France is already watching. The Minister of Commerce nodded tightly. Global markets are sensitive. If we go public with these findings, our trade routes will suffer. Quiet negotiations are more practical. Practical, scoffed the Minister of Culture, a rare voice in support of transparency. You mean profitable? You want to feed the silence again, just with cleaner utensils. Traore raised a hand. The room fell still. We will not sell silence. But cracks were already forming. That night, someone inside the cabinet did what no one expected. They leaked. High-resolution satellite images captured during the excavation at Kumasi Ridge appeared on a secure diplomatic server in Brussels. Minutes later, they were forwarded anonymously to French intelligence, a British envoy, and 2 embassies in West Africa. Within 24 hours, the tremors reached New York. The UN issued a formal letter citing concerns over the management of potentially destabilizing mineral assets. The phrase was cold, but the meaning was clear. You are holding something dangerous. Be careful who you show it to. By the next day, Traore's government received direct communications from the IMF and World Bank. Hidden in the language of cooperation were veiled warnings, economic consequences, reconsidered loans, subtle freezes. One memo even hinted that if Burkina Faso insisted on linking the gold publicly to colonial-era theft, developmental aid programs may be reevaluated. In a closed-door meeting, Traore threw the memo across the room. We dig up what was stolen and they threaten to take what's left. His chief of staff leaned in voice low. Someone inside the cabinet is working against you. Traore already knew. He could feel it. The subtle avoidance in eye contact. The words that danced around hard truths. The meetings that ended too quickly. The agendas rewritten in quiet fonts. And yet worse than betrayal was delay. While Mahama had stirred the people with words and the elders had invoked memory with wisdom, politics was grinding truth down to compromise. Outside, the country waited. In Koudagou, workers prepared the ground where the new museum would rise. Children still painted Mahama's face on school walls. In cities, students debated colonial reparations and the meaning of sovereignty. But inside government walls, fear was beginning to outweigh conviction. One minister whispered in a corridor, if they sanction us, we lose power. Roads, jobs. This movement, it could cost us everything. To which another replied, or it could finally give us something that was never for sale. But such voices were few. And as the leaks spread, so did paranoia. Emails were monitored, phones checked, loyalty questioned. Traore knew the referendum still had public support, but he also knew the truth: a war was coming, not with weapons, but with stories. The gold had been buried once, but now the deeper danger was who wanted it reburied, not in soil, but in spin. And this time they had more than guns. They had markets, media, diplomacy disguised as debt, and someone inside his own circle had lit the match. Despite mounting pressure, foreign warnings, and silent betrayal from within, President Traore did not yield. He stood before the cameras on a gray, windless morning and delivered the announcement the world had waited for. On Saturday, every citizen will have one question before them. Should the gold be used openly or hidden for reasons of national security? This will not be decided by elites. It will be decided by all of you. The referendum was set. Posters appeared in every province. Radios played the official message every hour. Schools handed out sample ballots for civic education lessons. Even villages without electricity received printed instructions carried by motorbikes and donkeys alike. The question was clear, and the consequences still unknown. As the day drew near, the country seemed to exhale and hold its breath all at once. News anchors debated endlessly. Clerics preached both caution and courage. Foreign embassies issued travel advisories. International investors waited, wallets half closed. Then dawn arrived, and with it came the people. Lines formed before polling stations even opened. Grandmothers with walking sticks. Teenagers holding voter ID cards for the first time. farmers in straw hats, former soldiers, teachers, traders, mechanics, mothers with babies tied to their backs. They stood in silence at first, then in murmurs, then slowly in shared voices. Some carried signs, our gold, our voice. Others wore white in solidarity with Mahama, who remained silent but watched the day unfold from a secure room in the capital, surrounded by guards and gravity. By midday, polling centers in Ouagadougou were overwhelmed. In Bobo Dioulasso, ballot boxes filled faster than expected and had to be replaced under armed escort. In the north, voting stations were guarded by community volunteers, elders sitting beside soldiers. In Koudougou, the square was transformed. The baobab tree beneath Mahama's mural was wrapped in cloth bearing the national colors. The school once vandalized was used as a polling place. Even children too young to vote gathered to watch their parents mark boxes with trembling pens. Outside one rural station, a woman stepped out, tears in her eyes. "My grandfather was taken to dig those mines," she said to a journalist. "Today I vote for him." Everywhere the same question echoed, not just the one on the ballot, but the one behind it. Do we want the world to know who we really are? The atmosphere hung heavy with hope and fear. Some feared war, others feared betrayal, but many, perhaps most, feared silence. They remembered what Mahama had said in his broadcast: "If we hide it again, we bury not just the gold, but our future." As dusk fell, final voters rushed in before the doors closed. Ballots were sealed, boxes stacked, streets cleared. For the first time in the nation's history, it had chosen not between candidates, but between memory and myth. Traore stood at his desk long into the night, staring at the map of his country, lit by pinpricks of polling data streaming in. He whispered to no one, "Let the people speak." And in the silence that followed, it was not fear that lingered. It was the sound of something older, something deeper, the sound of a country unlearning how to be quiet. The announcement came at exactly noon. A single broadcast, one voice, no drum roll, no build-up. Just the cold, clear finality of numbers carried through radios, TV sets, and loudspeakers across the nation, with 87% in favor. The people of Burkina Faso have voted to use the gold, openly, transparently, and for public good. The country didn't erupt into noise. Not at first. There was only stillness. As if in that one moment, 20 million people stopped moving, just to hear whether they were truly being heard. Then came the sound. Applause in schoolyards, shouts from rooftops, car horns in the city center, dancers in village squares, elders hugging strangers, teenagers crying into their palms. Markets paused. Mosques rang with quiet thanks. Churches opened their doors wide. And in a dusty safe house far from the capital, Mahama sat alone with the volume turned low. He didn't smile. Not right away. He simply stared at the screen. And then tears. Not loud, not heavy, just one, then another, then another. He pressed the tips of his fingers together as if offering something invisible back to the world. "They chose light," he whispered. The next morning, construction began, not in secret, not behind fences, in the open, with cameras, with ceremony, and most of all, with community. In the east, workers broke ground on the first free maternal health clinic. In the north, a teachers' training college was announced named after Mahama. In the capital, entire neighborhoods signed up to help pave new roads, build libraries, and restore neglected hospitals. Universities created open courses in colonial history and reparations literacy. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but for the first time in a long time, the people felt like owners, not observers. And as these foundations rose from the same soil that had once hidden what was stolen, President Traore stood before the press with one final promise: every clinic, every classroom, every paved road built with this gold will carry a single plaque. It will not bear my name, nor any minister's. It will say only this: taken, returned. There were no follow-up questions. There didn't need to be. History was already being rewritten, not in ink, but in brick, in steel, and sweat. And beneath every new structure, just like the gold once buried in Kumasi Ridge, something else now lived, a memory they refused to silence. There were no speeches, no ribbon cutting, no red carpet, just sun, dust, laughter, and bricks stacked one by one in a place where the past had once been buried and now where the future would stand. The first national project funded by the recovered gold began not in the capital, but in Kudugu, a school. Not just any school, but on the exact ground where Mahama had once swept chalk dust off cracked tiles before sunrise, where he had taught colonial history from a torn textbook, and where he had first unlocked the phone that changed a nation. Now that space was being reborn, not with silence, but with song. The entire village came out that morning. Men with shovels, women with pots of porridge, elders with stories in their eyes, and children everywhere. Children, some too young to carry bricks, but eager to carry hope. The ground had already been cleared. Surveyors from the Ministry of Development had laid out the new design: 4 classrooms, a solar-powered library, an open-air amphitheater, and a shaded teacher's hall. But before any cement was poured, before any foundation was laid, the village insisted on one thing. They would lay the first brick themselves. It was Mama Fumata, now too frail to stand alone, who placed her wrinkled hand on the first stone, guided by the arms of her grandchildren. "This," she said, "is for the truth we forgot to speak. Let this school never forget." Then came the children. One by one, they formed a line, passing bricks, hand to hand, like they were passing memory history, something sacred. Mahama stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed at first, his shirt dusted with earth tears hiding in the corners of his eyes. He watched as Awa led a group of younger students, their palms red with clay, singing a song she had written for the occasion. The words were simple but powerful. We build with truth. We build with light. We build because silence stole our sight. Later that afternoon, when the walls had risen waist high, a ceremony of another kind took place. Near the eastern corner of the schoolyard, just beyond where the old blackboard once leaned against the tree stump, a hole was dug. Not deep, not for hiding, but for growing. Into it, the village planted a young baobab sapling, tall, slender, its roots barely formed. Children took turns patting the soil around it. A small wooden sign was hammered into the earth beside it. "Let this tree never forget what the land once held." Mahama finally stepped forward when most of the villagers had moved to rest. He stood before the baobab, reached out and let his fingers brush its fragile bark. When it's tall enough, he whispered, "It'll see the whole schoolyard." Awa appeared beside him, quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Will you teach here again?" Mahama didn't answer right away. He looked at the school rising from the earth. He looked at the children running between scaffolding. He looked at the shadow of the baobab stretching toward the foundation like a blessing. Then he said softly, "Maybe I never stopped." That night, as dusk rolled in over Kudugu, the village glowed not with electric lights, but with a kind of warmth that no satellite could capture. In homes lit by lanterns and small solar panels, parents told their children not fairy tales but true ones. About a phone, about gold, about a teacher who handed truth to power and handed power back to the people. And about a school rising slowly, one brick at a time, from soil that once held secrets, but now held something far greater, a future no one could steal again. There were no reporters that day, no podiums, no red carpets, no news helicopters circling overhead. Just a quiet procession of villagers in their Sunday best, barefoot children, chasing each other between rows of newly planted shrubs, and a light breeze carrying the scent of freshly mixed cement through the schoolyard. The sun sat high above Kudugu, warming the smooth granite walls of the new building. The bricks were still sharp at the edges, the doors freshly painted in a deep earth red, and above the entrance, etched into polished stone, were the words "École du Courage Mahama." Truth begins with courage. Mahama stood in front of the plaque with President Traore beside him. Neither wore a suit. The president's sleeves were rolled up. His shoes were dusty. Mahama had borrowed a clean shirt from one of the elders, ironed gently the night before by candlelight. There was no official program, no anthem. The only music came from the children's laughter and the clapping of hands as the final classroom door was opened. Inside, rows of handmade wooden desks gleamed in the light. A new blackboard spanned the length of the front wall. Above it, a hand-painted banner read, "This school was built on buried truth. May it always stand in sunlight." Villagers filed in slowly, reverently. Some touched the walls. Others simply stood and stared. Several elders wept without wiping their cheeks. At the center of the courtyard, the young baobab tree swayed gently in the wind. A few of its leaves had already browned in the heat, but its roots had taken. A small fence had been built around it, not to keep people out, but to remind them to protect it. As Mahama approached the tree, a small boy tugged gently at his sleeve. "Monsieur Mahama," the boy asked, tilting his head. "Will the tree grow?" Mahama knelt beside him, brushing soil gently away from a leaf. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the plaque again. He looked at the classrooms. He looked at the president, now crouched beside a group of children, showing him their chalk drawings of golden crates and satellite maps. Then softly he replied, "Only if we water it with truth." The boy nodded, serious beyond his years. "I'll bring water tomorrow." The ceremony ended without an ending. People stayed, sat in the shade, shared bread, played drums, told stories. Children chased each other through the hallways. A group of mothers began sweeping the floors no one asked them to. They simply wanted it clean for the next day. Mahama remained near the tree long after the crowd thinned. Awa sat beside him with her notebook sketching the leaves. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sun dipped lower, casting a long shadow from the baobab over the school steps, like an arm stretching forward, pointing toward something far ahead. The school was open. The plaque was real. The gold had been used not to decorate, but to rebuild. And the child's question, "Will the tree grow?" was not about wood or water, but about memory, about legacy, about whether truth once spoken could live long enough to root itself in a place that had once been taught to forget. The classroom was only the beginning. Months after the Kudugu school opened its doors, Project Legacy officially launched a national initiative to reinvest the recovered gold into long-term public good. But this time, there would be no hidden contracts, no backdoor deals. The president kept his promise. A civilian oversight board made up of teachers, nurses, engineers, elders, and students from every province was formed to monitor the project's scope and spending. They met every month. They kept minutes. And most importantly, they published everything. Every quarter, transparency reports were made available online and posted on school walls, clinic doors, and church gates. People gathered to read them out loud to those who couldn't. The reports listed line by line what was built where, for how much, and by whom. People began to trust numbers again, not because they were told to, but because they could see the results with their own eyes. In the north, solar panels were installed in villages that had known only darkness. At night, light spilled from windows where once there had only been kerosene shadows. Children studied after sunset. Mothers walked safely to local health posts. In the west, mobile clinics brought prenatal care to rural women who had never before been seen by a doctor. Within 6 months, infant mortality dropped by 18%. In the south, new community libraries opened beside boreholes, each filled with donated books and handmade shelves. Literacy programs began. Reading circles formed. Elders began sharing folk tales, writing them down for the first time. And in every public building, one phrase was etched into stone or carved into wood: taken. Returned. It became more than a slogan. It became a reminder of pain, yes, but also of possibility. Mahama never returned to teaching full-time, but he visited schools often, sometimes sitting quietly in the back row of history classes, watching children raise their hands to ask questions their grandparents never dared to ask. He refused titles, declined interviews, turned down medals. He walked instead, through markets, along rivers, across the dusty roads that once carried colonial trucks away, with crates full of silence. One evening he stood beneath the now-growing baobab tree outside the Kudugu school. Its branches stretched high. Leaves flickered in the dusk wind. Children ran past him laughing. A new class bell echoed from the courtyard. He closed his eyes. The air smelled of dust mangoes and chalk, and he whispered more to himself than anyone else. We planted memory, and it grew. The road into Kudugu had changed. No longer a ribbon of dirt, but a smooth stretch of tar, winding between villages, connecting lives and stories. Market stalls had grown in color and number, filled with students in uniforms, mango vendors and elders playing cards beneath thatched canopies. Kudugu had become a name not just whispered, but taught, spoken proudly, remembered deliberately. Mahama stepped down from the government vehicle with a quiet grunt. His beard was gray now, thinner in places. His walk slower, carried the deliberate rhythm of age, but not weakness. His eyes behind new glasses still scanned the horizon like they did years ago, searching for things most people overlooked. The school stood taller than he remembered. 4 buildings now, each with solar panels gleaming on their roofs. A proper library, its shelves filled and organized. An auditorium modest but alive with murals painted by children from every region. In the central courtyard, the baobab tree stood wide and strong, its limbs outstretched like a guardian. Underneath its shade, a group of children sat on mats, reading aloud to one another. A young teacher, a woman who couldn't have been older than 25, watched them closely, her face bright with purpose. Mahama smiled. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood, letting the moment wash over him like wind through dry grass. Behind him, a van pulled up. Reporters stepped out, adjusting microphones, cameras, and notepads. It was the 10-year anniversary of the referendum, the day the country chose to remember, and they had come for one voice only. Mr. Mahama, one of them called, approaching gently. "We're honored you agreed to meet us." He turned slowly, nodding. "I'm only here to visit a tree," he said. They laughed, unsure whether it was a joke. The lead reporter smiled. "Would you mind answering a few questions for the record?" He looked back at the children beneath the baobab. Then he said, "Only if you ask the right ones." They sat in a circle under the baobab's shade. No official press podium, no backdrop. Just notebooks, microphones held softly, and one old man whose presence quieted the wind. The interview had started light. Memories of the day the phone unlocked. The first brick laid. The sound of children singing when the school first opened. Mahama answered patiently, always redirecting praise toward others, the community, the president, the children themselves. But as the hour waned, the lead reporter finally leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, stepping forward. "Giving up your safety? Losing your old life?" The question settled like dust. Mahama didn't answer right away. He glanced sideways. The children were still reading. A boy was explaining a passage to another. One girl pointed to the mural of the golden crates and whispered something with wide eyes. Behind them, the wind stirred the baobab leaves, soft and constant, like a memory refusing to fade. He inhaled deeply. "I lost peace," he said. "That's true." His eyes didn't meet theirs at first. "I lost sleep. I lost comfort. I lost the quiet life I once loved." Then he looked up. "But I gained something greater, memory." The journalist sat still, pens frozen mid-word. "Fear passes," he continued. "You carry it, yes, but it weakens the longer you walk with it. Truth stays. It outlives you. And sometimes that's the only thing worth leaving behind." The reporter spoke again, voice softer now. "So you'd do it again?" He smiled faintly. "I was just a teacher," he said. "All I did was stop being quiet." The crowd left with the fading sun. Reporters packed up their gear. Children walked home in clusters, still chattering. Teachers locked classroom doors. Awa, now a teacher herself, waved at Mahama from the steps of the library. He waved back, then turned and made his way toward the tree. He sat beneath its thick trunk, opened a notebook worn at the edges, and pulled out the pen he'd carried for decades. The same one he used to grade papers, to scribble translations of encrypted messages, to write the speech he never gave on national radio. Now he used it for one more sentence. He wrote slowly, letting each word take its place. "Courage is a seed. When planted in truth, it gives shade to those who never knew your name." He closed the notebook. The breeze grew stronger, and the branches of the baobab swayed above him, casting flickering shadows over the plaque that bore his name. From the courtyard came the sound of laughter, real, unburdened, alive. Golden light spilled across the school walls. Mahama leaned back, eyes closed, face tilted toward the sun. And then, in a quiet voice that only the wind could carry, he said, "The truth was never lost. It was waiting beneath the soil for someone brave enough to dig." Some stories entertain, others inform, but a rare few like this one remind us of who we are, and more importantly, who we could become. The story of Mahama is not just about a phone, a secret, or even 5 tons of stolen gold. It's about the quiet power of truth and the courage it takes to protect it, especially when no one is asking you to. It's a story rooted in injustice, but it blossoms into something deeper, a reclaiming of memory, dignity, and self-determination. At its heart, Mahama is an ordinary man, a village teacher, a listener, a gardener of young minds. And yet when history knocks, he answers. Not with fanfare or fury, but with steady hands and a voice that chooses truth over comfort. He doesn't seek attention, legacy, or revenge. What he seeks is clarity, and in doing so, he becomes the symbol of something larger than himself. What struck me most is that the transformation in this story doesn't come through violence, protest, or political revolution. It comes through knowledge, through education, through conversation, through the simple act of placing a truth long buried back in the hands of the people who deserve to know it. And look at what happens when truth is made public. Children study at night under electric lights for the first time. Mothers hold healthy babies. Villagers learn to read not just names but their own history. And a tree grows in Kutugu, a tree not of wealth but of witness. The gold was never the real treasure. The real treasure was the truth. And when people finally saw it, they didn't burn it, they built with it. That to me is what makes this story so powerful. It doesn't end in revenge, it ends in rebirth. In a world where silence is often rewarded and fear is easily weaponized, this story asks a quiet but essential question. What happens when one person chooses not to stay quiet? That question doesn't just apply to Muhammad. It applies to us, to you, to me. You don't need to uncover buried gold to be brave. Sometimes courage is helping someone speak up. Sometimes it's remembering what others want us to forget. And sometimes it's planting a truth that might not grow in your lifetime, but will shade someone else's. So as we leave Muhammad's story behind, I invite you to reflect on this. Is there a truth in your life, your family, your town, your country, that deserves to be spoken, even if it's hard to say? Let's keep the conversation going, because sometimes the most powerful roots grow in silence until someone listens. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.